I took the job because it paid better than anything else in Buffalo at the time. Being a night watchman during the Pan American Exposition wasn't exactly glamorous, but it came with a crisp new uniform and 2 hot meals per shift, which was more than most were getting in 1901. They told me my route would mostly be around the electric tower and the machinery hall, both impressive structures that lit up like daylight thanks to all the newfangled electrical wiring strung across the fairgrounds. I was still getting used to the idea of electricity being more than a novelty. At night, it made the place feel strange, beautiful, but not natural. My hours started just after the last crowds cleared out. Midnight to dawn, walking the same path past empty food stands and pavilions, checking locks, keeping kids and drunks from sneaking in. Some nights were quiet as a church. Others, I'd hear laughter echoing from far corners, too far for me to do anything about. I got used to that sort of thing. What I didn't get used to were the blackouts. Sometimes 1 or 2 of the arc lights would blink off without warning. Just a pop and a short hum, like the wires were groaning. The fair electricians said the system was temperamental and that too much humidity in the air could short a connection. I didn't think much of it until one night in early October. I was walking the stretch behind the electricity building when a whole line of lamps blinked out in a ripple, like dominoes falling. Everything went dark, and in that moment, I swear I saw someone standing at the far end of the walkway just for a second. Tall, unmoving, and oddly shimmering, like the air around him was buzzing. I took a step toward the spot, but by the time the lights came back on a few seconds later, whoever or whatever it was had vanished. I stood there for a while, heart thudding in my ears, convincing myself it was just an after-image from the lights blinking out so fast. The next night, I took a lantern with me. They told us not to, said it gave the wrong impression to guests who might still be wandering out after hours. But I didn't care. I wasn't about to be stuck in the dark again with whatever I'd seen. My route was unchanged, past the Temple of Music, across the canal bridge, then behind the electricity building. And right as I reached that spot again, near where the lights had gone out the night before, it happened a second time. Same sequence. A soft pop, then darkness rolling in a wave. This time, my lantern flickered too. That's what froze me. There was that hum again, like a loose wire vibrating against metal, low and unpleasant. And standing just past the footpath, maybe 20 yards ahead, was the figure again. But now I could see more. The outline shimmered like it wasn't really solid. The shape of a man, but wrong somehow. Narrow shoulders, too long in the arms. And there was this static buzz, like the hum of one of those new wireless sets I'd seen in the exhibits. It didn't move. I backed away without turning around, the same way I'd seen stable hands do with a spooked horse. When I got around the corner of the building, the lights came back on. I stood under one until sunrise. I reported it the next morning. My supervisor, a thick-necked guy named Griggs, gave me a long look and told me to lay off the coffee after midnight. I wasn't the only one who'd mentioned odd outages or strange sounds, he admitted. But the official line was squirrels chewing wires or too much damp in the air. I didn't push it, but from that night on, I kept my eyes sharp and stuck close to the routes that stayed fully lit. Still, that humming sound stayed in my ears long after my shifts ended, like it had crawled in and didn't want to leave. A few weeks later, Griggs came to me just before sundown and asked if I could take over for Harlan, one of the other guards who'd called out sick. It meant covering a different route, near the old Midway and the abandoned test area where some of the lighting prototypes had been. I didn't like it, but I said yes. The fair was winding down by then, and the nights were colder. The area he sent me to was half dead. Rows of unlit stalls, a few torn banners still flapping in the wind. I kept the lantern lit even when I wasn't supposed to. I made it halfway through the second hour when I heard that hum again. Not ahead of me this time, behind me. I turned fast and saw the same flickering silhouette, but now it was closer than ever, less than 30 feet. It didn't walk, didn't move like a person. It just shifted forward, like a weak radio signal coming into focus. The static got louder, so loud I thought my ears might bleed. I backed away, then turned and ran. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. I ended up near the Manufactures and Liberal Arts building, out of breath and soaked with sweat. There was a scorched patch on the gravel behind me where I'd seen it. I quit the next morning. Didn't give notice. Just packed my things and got on a train out of Buffalo. I'd lasted through the worst of it, and I figured the thing, whatever it was, belonged to that place, to the fairgrounds and its wires and blinking lights. Years later, I read that they dismantled most of the exposition and sold off the parts. The land went dark again. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else ever saw what I did. If maybe something got woken up when they lit the place like that. Something drawn to the current, to the flicker and hum. But I never went back. I never even told my own kids about it. I didn't want them asking questions I couldn't answer. I was staying with my uncle in Benevento in early 1901, in a stone farmhouse not far from the village. I'd just turned 20 and had taken a short leave from my work as a clerk in Naples after a winter illness. The air was crisp even in late January, and though the olive trees stood still in the cold, there was always a scent of smoke and damp earth in the evenings. My uncle, Matteo, was a quiet man who spent most of his days tending vines and reading the Corriere della Sera by oil lamp. Life moved slowly out there. Slower than Naples, that's for sure. But I didn't mind. News of Queen Victoria's death had just reached us. I remember Matteo folded his paper and muttered, "Another dead queen. It's the end of something." I wasn't sure what he meant. We weren't English, and besides, Italy had only just become a unified kingdom. It wasn't our empire that ended. Still, there was something strange about the way the villagers talked about it. That night at the osteria, an older man said the bell at San Michele had rung 3 times just before dawn, on its own. People laughed nervously, but no one outright denied it. I didn't think much of it until a few days later, when I was walking back from the town square after dark. As I passed the edge of the olive grove, I heard it. One slow, hollow toll from the old bell tower on the ridge. I stopped in the road. There was no wind, no footsteps, just the single note hanging in the air like something waiting to answer it. I could see the bell tower clearly against the moonlight. No lights, no movement. But something about the silence after that toll didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I asked Matteo if he'd heard the bell. He didn't look up from his breakfast, just said, "Stay out of the grove after dark." I told him I'd only been near the edge, coming back from town, but he didn't say anything else. That same afternoon, I went to Mass at San Michele. The priest, Don Rinaldi, was kind but tight-lipped. When I asked about the bell ringing by itself, he didn't deny it. He just said, "Some things are older than the church, and the land remembers." It was such a strange way to put it, but it didn't feel like superstition, more like warning. That night I stayed in, but just before bed, I stepped outside for a moment. The sky was cloudy, no stars. I didn't hear anything at first, just the sound of wind in the trees. Then, faintly, like from far down the hill, came that toll again. One note, then another. Not frantic, not rhythmic, just 3 slow chimes. I stood there in my nightshirt, staring toward the ridge, and I swear I saw movement between the olive trees. Not animals, shapes. Dozens of them, walking slowly uphill, flickering in and out of view like fog crossing a lantern's path. I shut the door and bolted it without saying a word. The next morning, my uncle had already left to trade eggs at the market, so I walked into the village. I asked around, casually, pretending I was just curious. A woman at the bakery said her grandfather used to talk about something similar during Garibaldi's time. Shadows in the groves, bells tolling without cause. She said it was tied to a local saying, something like, "When the crown dies, the dead walk again." I laughed it off in front of her, but I noticed she didn't smile back. 2 nights later, I woke up suddenly. No sound, just a pressure in the air that felt wrong. I crept to the window facing the grove and saw the bell tower silhouetted against a low red glow, like someone had lit torches. But there was no fire, no people, just that dull, pulsing light. Then the bell rang again, louder this time. It shook the shutters. I rushed to my uncle's room, but it was empty, the bed untouched. I felt a chill I still can't explain. I grabbed my coat and boots and went out, not toward the tower, but around to the grove's edge. What I saw is still hard to put into words. A line of people, or figures, was moving in silence between the trees, all heading uphill toward the old well behind the chapel ruins. They looked translucent in the moonlight, and every few steps they would pause, like listening for something. One of them turned its head, slowly, like its neck was stiff, and I swear it looked straight at me. I didn't run. I couldn't. I stood frozen until the last figure disappeared behind the chapel wall, and the bell gave one final ring. Then everything went still. The next morning, Mateo came back like nothing had happened. I asked him where he went, and he just shrugged and said, "There's always a price for peace in old places." I left Benevento a week later. The world was changing, motor cars, telegraphs, empires shifting. But in that village, it felt like time hadn't moved at all. I still don't know who rang the bell, or why those things walked through the olive groves. But I do know that on the night Queen Victoria died, something old stirred beneath that land, and I was there to see it happen. I started at the Dunning Asylum in the summer of 1901, just after my 24th birthday. My uncle had helped me get the job after I finished my training at Provident. Most of the nurses were older than me, and a few didn't seem thrilled by the idea of someone new poking around. The buildings were old and creaky, and most nights there was a heavy, sour smell in the air that you stopped noticing if you stayed long enough. The shift hours rotated constantly, and the overnight ones were always the worst. There were fewer orderlies on duty then, and the halls felt too quiet even with the occasional shouting from the wards. I kept to myself for the most part, going room to room with my little lantern and making sure everyone was accounted for. I'd gotten used to the oddness of the place quickly. Patients talking to shadows, staff muttering things they didn't realize were out loud. But I kept my head down. I was there to work, not to make trouble. One night, I was sent down to the old records room in the West Wing. The supervisor said they needed me to check on a misplaced patient ledger. The West Wing hadn't been used for housing in years. It was mostly storage and a few unused offices, but it wasn't sealed off. I found the door unlocked, the hinges groaning as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was cold and smelled like damp paper. On the desk was a thick black ledger with a leather strap, just sitting there with no tag. I assumed it was the one they wanted, so I picked it up to bring it back. But before I did, I opened it, just out of curiosity. The ledger wasn't organized like the modern ones. No tabs, no index. Just pages and pages of names in the same tight, slanted handwriting, followed by dates of admittance and short remarks in red ink. Most of the entries were older, 1880s, 1890s, but some had notes scribbled in more recent years. What caught my attention wasn't the dates, though. It was the names. I saw a familiar one on the third page, Martha Kay, an older nurse who worked the morning shift on Ward C. The entry said she was admitted in 1893 for paranoid delusions. There was no discharge date. I thought maybe I was looking at the wrong person. Maybe just a coincidence. But then I saw another. Thomas R.L. That was the name of one of the night orderlies. Same thing. Admitted in 1889. No discharge. It felt like a bad joke. I flipped further and saw Helen G., a name I recognized immediately because it was mine. Right there in red ink, admitted July 1901, dissociative episodes, identity delusions. My hand went cold, and for a few seconds I just stared at the page. There was no discharge listed for me either. I shut the book and backed away from the desk. The door creaked behind me, and for a second I thought someone had come in, but the hallway was empty. I took the ledger back upstairs, but didn't mention what I saw. That night I couldn't sleep, even after my shift ended. The next day I casually brought up Nurse Martha Kay to another girl during break and asked how long she'd worked there. She looked confused and said she thought Martha was just a part of the place. I tried to clarify, asked if she meant she was a longtime staff member. She laughed and said, "No, I don't think she's on payroll." The conversation ended weirdly. The girl looked uncomfortable, like I'd said something I shouldn't have. That afternoon, I checked the staff logbook. Martha Kay wasn't in it. A week passed, and I kept the discovery to myself. But things at the asylum started to feel off. I noticed that the halls were never truly empty, even during the night shift. You'd hear shuffling just ahead of you, but no one would be there when you turned the corner. I watched Martha hand out medicine, take vitals, do everything a nurse would, but no one ever spoke to her directly. She didn't even use the staff break room. I tried to talk to her once, just said good morning in the hallway. She looked at me for a long second and kept walking. Not rude, just like she didn't understand the words. The last straw was 2 nights later. I woke up in the cot behind the Ward B desk, where we sometimes napped during long shifts, and found the old ledger sitting on the floor next to me. I hadn't touched it since I'd put it back, but now it was open to the final page, and my name was written there again, this time with a discharge date. That date was tomorrow. Below it, in red ink, was a single word: removed. I didn't sleep again. I stayed at the front entrance until dawn, then told the front desk I was sick and left. I never came back. Years later, after I'd moved back to St. Louis and started working at a proper clinic, I looked up the asylum just to settle my nerves. Dozens of unrecorded patients had been buried on the grounds, and some names in the burial records were also listed under staff, including Martha K., including Thomas R.L. No mention of me, though. But sometimes I wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night?